Chapter 17. If Katie was in the clutches of those bloodthirsty Hessians, Matt knew that he had to do everything in his power to rescue her. When Henry and Israel had first told him of the mercenaries, Matt had been terrified at the thought of having to face the giants. Now he was so worried about Katie that he was afraid he wouldn't be able to find them. Matt walked over to Hooter and Tony, who had joined the Indian boys. They were filling a leather bag with some bright red berries they'd picked off the bush. Hooter was about to put some in his mouth when one of the Indians grabbed his hand and knocked the berries out of it. "Whoa," Hooter called out. "What's the matter?" "They must not be safe for eating, Hoot." "Look," Matt said, pointing to the shorter Indian, who was holding the stomach and making a face. "He's trying to show you that the berries are poison." "So if they don't eat them, what do they do with them?" Hooter wondered aloud. "I don't know what they do with them," Tony said as he watched the Indians continue to fill the bag, "but I bet they could tell you where all the berries are in these woods and which ones are poisonous and which ones are not. I'd give anything to know the kind of stuff they know." "You're right, Tony, you're right," Matt mumbled. "They probably do know a lot of things about these woods, and if anyone could tell us where the Hessians and Katie and Key are, I bet they could." "Well, it's too bad you can't ask them," Tony sighed. "Who says I can't?" Matt replied, walking up to the taller Indian boy. We need to find the soldiers," Matt began. "Big, tall men," he said, putting his hands over his head. Then he motioned to his clothes. "They have fancy uniforms and guns." Matt picked up a stick and aimed it like a gun. "And they have my little sister," he tried to tell them, getting down on his knees and walking around with his thumb in his mouth. The Indians stood watching him in silence, and then they looked at each other and began to laugh. Hooter and Tony laughed too, for Matt did look pretty funny. "Cut it out, guys," Matt ordered, taking his thumb out of his mouth. Suddenly he had an idea. Everyone watched as Matt reached for some red berries and then held them next to his own brown hair. "Red berries, red hair," he said, putting his thumb back in his mouth. "Do you see? Little one has red hair." The taller Indian stopped laughing as a look of recognition came over his face. He shook his head and said something to his friend, and they both looked back to Matt, shaking their heads and pointing down the trail. "They've seen them! They've seen them!" Matt exclaimed, suddenly standing. "Will you show me?" he asked, pointing to them and then himself. But a worried look came over the Indians' faces, and Matt realized that they too were afraid of the Hessian soldiers. "I wish we had something to offer them," Matt sighed. "I've got $2, Hooter said, taking the bills out of his pocket. He offered them to the Indians, but they were not impressed. "I didn't think they're too interested in money," Tony said. "Oh, but wait, I do have something they might like." He reached in his pocket and pulled out a pocket video game. It measured just 4 inches long and was made of blue and white plastic. He pressed the on button. "Here, you can try it," Tony said, offering the game to the Indians. One of them cautiously opened his hand and accepted the gift. He looked down and was astonished to see a tiny man running back and forth in the small screen. With a frightened yelp, the Indian dropped the game and backed away from it. Tony reached down to the ground and picked it up with a great deal of coaxing. He placed the game back in the Indian's hand. "It's a toy," Tony tried to explain. "For fun. Just for fun." He reached over and pushed the tiny buttons on the bottom panel. As the miniature man jumped up and down, the Indian boy's fingers began to tremble. He was certain that some white man's magic had been used to trap the little man inside the box. He quickly turned the game over in his hand, trying to find a way to free the miniature prisoner. When he opened the door on the back and discovered the batteries, he smiled. The batteries were blue and red and would make good trinkets for trading. He pulled them out and handed them to his friend. "No, you've got to leave the batteries in or the game won't work," Tony told him. The Indian turned the game over and looked at the empty screen, thinking that the tiny man must have fallen out through the door. The Indian boys knelt down on the ground and began to search for him. Tony knelt beside the Indians. "You had to put them back in the game," he said, reaching for the batteries. The Indians, however, decided that they liked the magic box and trinkets and didn't want to part with them. They untied pouches that were fastened to their pants, and into these they dropped their newly acquired gifts. Then they tied their pouches tight and resumed their search. Tony finally gave up and sat down on a log to wait, with Matt and Hooter beside him. "That video game cost me 10 weeks' allowance," Tony sighed as he watched the Indian boys continue their hunt. "Don't worry about it," Hooter told him. "You can always buy another one once we get home." "You mean if we get home," Tony said, kicking a stone. "Don't talk like that, Tony," Hooter implored. "We're going to get home. We are, aren't we, Matt?" Matt looked over at Hooter and tried to smile. Sure, Hoot, he said. We'll get home. Oh, really? Tony said. And just how do you suppose that we're going to do that? Yeah, Matt, Hooter said. How are we going to do that? He looked back over to Matt, who had lowered his eyes to the ground. I don't know just yet, Matt said softly. I don't have all the answers, you know. His voice trailed off to a whisper. Well, you'd better find some answers, Tony suddenly demanded. It was your idea that we started this club, and your idea that we go on the hike. You're the one that always wants to be the leader. You led us into this mess, and so now you better figure out how you're going to lead us out of it. Tony's outburst was followed by a long silence. Matt knew that Tony was right. He knew that if he hadn't suggested that they go on the hike, none of them would be here now. It was his responsibility to get them home safely. But how? It seemed impossible. Matt suddenly thought of the general and the seemingly impossible situation he had placed his troops in last night. Yeah, Matt knew that if General Washington had not ordered the dangerous crossing of the Delaware, the entire war may well have been lost. He knew that the taking of Trenton seemed like an impossible task, and yet it was crucial to the rebel cause. The general had everything against him last night, Matt told the others. His army was in rags and half frozen. The river was full of ice. Even the weather was against him. And yet he kept going. He could have stayed home in a warm house in Virginia, but instead he was out here last night, risking his life. Yeah, but his home was in Virginia, miles away, not light years, Tony added. Only, Tony, what the general went through last night must have seemed just as impossible as our situation seems today, Matt said. I did get you into this, but I really thought every member of this club was ready for adventure and could handle it. You have to admit we've done pretty good so far. He paused, looking from Tony to Hooter. I know it's scary to be here, but if we, when we get home, just think of the memories we'll have, and I'll do everything I can to get us back home, I promise, Matt said with conviction. Tony kicked another stone. I'll believe it when I see it, he said, keeping his eyes to the ground. Well, I believe in you, Chief, Hooter quickly spoke up. I know you can get us home. Matt nodded. Thanks his thanks to Hooter, but couldn't help frowning. He knew that Tony didn't think he was such a good leader, and he had to admit that he was full of doubts himself. But as he sat on the log reflecting on all that he'd been through, Matt suddenly realized that he had held up pretty well. He hadn't left Israel to die by himself, and he had found the courage to go on alone into the woods with Blackjack. I might not have all the answers right now, Matt was thinking, but I have faced danger, and I know that I do have courage. I just hope that I have enough. He sat staring at the ground, lost in thought. When he finally looked up, he saw the Indians standing before them. They had given up their search and were waiting for another offering. One of the Indians looked down at Matt's shoes. He pointed to them and said something that Matt couldn't understand. I think he wants your shoes, Chief, Hooter said. Hey, what happened to your sneakers? Tony asked. It's a long story, Matt sighed. I guess I can get along with just socks, if it means that they'll help us find Katie and Q, he said, taking off the old shoes. When he handed them over, however, he was surprised to see the Indian pull out the buckles and then throw the shoes on the ground. I don't get it, Hooter rumbled. You'd think that he would want to keep the shoes. It's not like there are shoe stores all over the place. He doesn't need a shoe store, Tony pointed out. Just look at what he's got on his feet. Hooter and Matt looked down at the sturdy, fur-lined moccasin boots that the Indian wore. He probably made them himself. Can you imagine making your own sneakers? I guess we may know a lot about video games, but they sure know more about survival, Matt said, putting his feet back in the old shoes. Just then the Indians began walking through some bushes off to the right of the trail. They stopped and turned around, waiting for Matt and the boys to follow. Matt stood trying to decide what to do. He hated leaving Blackjack and the security of the trail, but he knew that if there was any chance of finding Katie, this was it. He walked over to Blackjack and patted his head. Thanks for the ride, old boy. I wish I could take you with, but it looks like we're going off the trail and you'd get all tangled up in there, Matt whispered, looking into the mule's big dark eyes. Blackjack nodded patiently. Go on now, giddy up, Matt called, giving the mule a slap in the rump, but Blackjack turned his head and looked back, waiting. No, I can't go with you, Matt said, coming up beside him. He nuzzled his face in the mule's soft black coat. I always thought that it would be great to have a horse. Now I know that it would be even better to have a mule. This is goodbye, Blackjack, he whispered. The old mule blinked his eyes and looked as if he were smiling. Go on, then. Giddy up, Matt called, slapping his rump again. This time Blackjack moved forward and didn't stop. Come on, Matt. They're leaving, Tony called as he and Hooter followed the Indians into the woods. Matt hurried after them, turning around to take one last look. The old black mule seemed dwarfed by the towering evergreens that lined the path. Their silvery branches hung low with the weight of the crystal-like snow. There was a faint tinkling of icicles as the wind gently wove its way through the glittering trees. It was a picture all white and iced with silver, except for the lone traveler whose soft black fur glistened in the morning light. Matt felt tears coming to his eyes as he stood watching the little mule making his way slowly down the path. So many goodbyes, he thought. First Israel, and then Mr. Hornby, and now Blackjack. And with each goodbye came the question of who and what would he find next? Would he ever find his way to Katy? Would they ever find their way home? Matt turned and followed the Indians as they moved deeper into the forest. He felt a shiver of excitement run through him as he stepped further into the wild, untamed wood.